So making sense of legalese in bills and understanding bill language, which can be a bit intimidating, but it just is a matter of kind of knowing what to look for and taking the time to look through it and figuring out that, well, some of these things can actually be broken down into simpler terms. You don't need to be a PhD to actually understand this stuff. So you all have been to this quite a few times, so I'll click through our intro. Take a moment to think about where we are on this beautiful piece of land. So how do we make sure we understand these bills? How are the terms defined? And also, how can we analyze these bills? There's a lot to be alert to, subtle nuances and loopholes and subtleties in language, which might not be apparent at first glance. So just kind of in general, finding legislation, which I think we've all kind of gone through, looking on the OLIS website. You can find a list of all the bills, and there's usually a short section on plain language. So first things to look for are the bill number, the title, the summary. The bill number helps you track it. It helps make it very searchable. You can sign up for those alerts so that you're getting updates on what's going on with the bills. The title, of course, and the summary. And yeah, something to think about is that many bills actually amend existing laws instead of creating new ones. So there's some key things to look for, and I'll show an example of a bill, but a lot of times there's kind of ways that language is noted, whether something is being added or removed. It's not often a law from scratch. Always make sure that you're looking at the latest version of the bill. It changes as it moves its way through. So just keep checking the website, don't just download the PDF of the bill and kind of think that's the final version. You'll have to kind of keep tracking it as it's moving through. Check the sponsors and co-sponsors, and just knowing who's backing the bill will kind of help you develop a strategy around it. And also it's important to look at when it's kicking in. Sometimes it's coming up soon. Sometimes it's way in the future when it's going to actually be enacted. So on the Oregon legislature website, there's actually this really handy document which you can go onto, and you can download this. And so this is a guide to reading the legislative measure. So I don't know if you've all looked through these bills before, but here on this side, this is what the bill looks like. But here it's showing you what all these things are. You can see who the sponsors are, the summary, if it's relating to a certain clause, what are the existing laws. There's a section with the actual proposed actions. And you can see like what the italics denote versus boldface. So if you're looking at a bill on the website, you could keep this open in another window and just sort of, refer back to it to just know what all these shorthand and different fonts mean. And then scrolling down, there's also a lot of definitions. So, the LC, legislative concept number, effective date, emergency clause, sunset clause. And then this is really helpful too. So the different types of measures, because we have bills and memorials and resolutions and joint resolutions, and they can get confusing because there's so many different kinds. So I think just having this document at the ready will really help just make sure that when you're going through your bill document or whatever the legislative piece is, that you can really understand it. And then we have types of laws. So I'm not going to read all these out loud, but I just want you to know that this resource is here. And then this abridged glossary, so reminders on what exactly an amendment is, these different roles, chief clerk of the House, committee assistants. So very helpful in just kind of getting a general picture of what's going on, all the moving parts and pieces and people around. a law. Oh. So,
Anna, can you drop that link in the chat?
yes. Great, and I'll stop sharing.
Okay.
There we go.
All right, so picking up sort of where Anna left off, I wanted to show you, we've looked at this website, the OLIS, the Oregon State Legislature website, a few times in previous trainings. But this is the page for the bag ban from the 2019 session. And so remember, I was noting to always make sure you check what session you're in, especially if you're using the main search function on the home page, because it can pull up things from older sessions. But I wanted to use the bag ban since it's something that has already passed. And so there's a lot of content in the page for House Bill 2509 from the 2019 session. If you need a refresher on how to navigate this website, you can watch the training from Tuesday about tracking bills and ordinances. And stay tuned for the blog post and the recording from that. But here's the text. And so introduced is just how it sounds. That's how the bill was introduced, the original text of it. And then there are a bunch of amendments. And so when Anna was saying, make sure you're looking at the current version of a bill, it should be the bottom one, the one at the end of this text list. And enrolled is the final version of it. So again, this is from a previous session that had already passed it. And this has all the sponsor information and the summary. So hopping into, sorry, my Zoom controls are blocking navigation. All right, so this is House Bill 2509 from the 2019 regular session. You can see the session up here. So this is Oregon's bag ban. Anna went through the anatomy, but just going through a bill to kind of look at some of the really important parts. And oftentimes the definitions are the most important part of a bill, because that's where loopholes can be found. And this is getting to what Dia started alluding to in our last session. So when you're looking at bags, which is what this bill was, it's really important to define everything that's being used in the bill. And this can be super tricky. And a big example of this is right now, legally, stores are using reusable plastic bags that are a certain thickness. And that is a really tricky thing to define in the bill, because if you think about all of the different reusable bags that you have, a lot of them are actually made out of plastic. Oftentimes those, like the cheaper ones that are given out for free, that's actually plastic. There's the REI bags that are like super sort of durable and stand up on their own. Those are made out of plastic. So trying to define a reusable bag while also banning plastic bags, but not banning the reusable plastic bags that are more durable, that some can be machine washable, is a really tricky thing. And so what ended up happening with the definitions in this law is that those reusable plastic bags that stores like Target and Walmart are now using that meet the minimum thickness requirements, those actually are legal. And so there's also right now currently an amendment to this bill, House Bill 2509, to redefine paper bags to include other fibers besides tree fiber, like straw. And so that also happens where there's, a producer of a sustainable single-use paper-like bag that uses non-tree fiber. And because the definition was so specific, those technically were not legal in Oregon. And so now the bill is getting amended this year to allow for those other types of fiber. And so that's where things can get really, really nuancy, and it gets a little tricky, but that's also where we have to be extremely careful to make sure we're not developing loopholes in the bill. I'm trying to scroll slowly down here. And so then when you're getting into the next section 2, that's where you're seeing all of these words that were defined up in section 1. And so it is really important to pay attention to those definitions. So in section 2, that's where it's saying a retail establishment, which is explicitly defined in section 1, may not provide single-use checkout bags, which single-use checkout bags are defined, and that they must charge for the recycled paper checkout bags and the reusable bags. And then something else, there might be other sections, like for this bill, there's a section that is for restaurants. So if there are different types of retail establishments that might have slightly different regulations, like restaurants have slightly different rules under this bill, so they're in another section of the bill. And then the bill usually ends with the enforcement information, which is what section 4 is, the enforcement part, like what happens if you aren't following the law. Essentially, the maximum fine is laid out in there. And then this one has a section 5 is actually about sort of research about compliance with the bill. And so the Department of Environmental Quality, in this case, a state agency, is charged with collecting information from retail establishments on the implementation of the bill. And then they have to submit a report on that to the legislature. And then Anna had mentioned sunset clause. And so section 6 is essentially saying that this only happens one time, this gathering of data and reporting. And so that's why that part is repealed after December 1st, 2025. So then the rest of the bill will remain intact, but that reporting requirement will go away on December 31st, 2025. And let's see. Oh yes, I skipped over this part of section 3, so I'm going to jump back there. Is anyone familiar with what preemption is? So preemption is when like a state makes it essentially illegal for a local municipality to pass a law about something. Sometimes, like with the straw bill that was passed in 2019, that straw bill was actually proposed by the plastics industry, and we called it a wolf in sheep's clothing. While it does make it so that straws can only be offered upon request, the real meat and the real goal behind that bill was to make it illegal for cities and counties to ban straws. And so we call that preemption, when the state is passing a law that makes it so that local municipalities cannot have a different regulation. And there are varying degrees of that. So in House Bill 2509, the bag ban, you'll see that local municipalities, I'm looking at section 3, subsection 1 right here. Local municipalities are able to have their own ordinance if it exactly matches House Bill 2509. They can amend, if they already have an ordinance, they can amend their ordinance to bring it up to be at least as strict as the state law. And it also allows them to have a higher fee than 5 cents on paper and reusable bags. So sometimes what that can do is set, like the state law is setting the floor. So that 5 cent fee is the floor. And the city of Portland could choose to have a 25-cent fee on paper bags, as long as it's not less than 5 cents. Are y'all still with me? Are there any questions? All right. This is like tricky stuff, and every bill is a little different, but definitely what I have learned is really, really pay attention to the definitions and try to make them as solid as possible and as clear as possible. But what still happens is, like with the bag ban, Surfrider doesn't stop at the campaign to get the law passed. We also developed a lot of educational materials to share with consumers on what the ban means for them, because we don't expect shoppers to read House Bill 2509 and understand what it means. Similarly, in Newport, for a local ordinance, there's a lot of outreach of this is what the ordinance means for you. That is in super plain language. And so Dia's not with us, but I pulled up House Bill 2365 from this current session, and this bill is dead. Unfortunately, it did not get a hearing by the deadline. So right now, this bill is not in play anymore, but it has some really interesting definitions that I wanted to take a look at. And this gets to, on Tuesday, Dia was asking about, how composting is defined or how bioplastics is defined. And some bills allow for compostable plastics, which aren't actually compostable in our systems. And this sometimes is a case, like Charlie, our policy manager, likes to say, it can take so long to write a bill and get support around a bill, like multiple legislative sessions. And so by the time you're really considering the bill language, the elected officials are considering the bill language and they understand the issues, we learn that bioplastics are bad. But maybe we didn't know that when we first started writing on it. So sometimes a bill gets passed before we have the information to make it stronger, but we've been learning a lot. So when we look at this plastic bill, which is a comprehensive foodware bill, you'll see some really interesting definitions in here, which I'm going to scroll to and hopefully not scroll too fast for anyone. So the term used in this bill is readily compostable, which means it can fully decompose in an at-home system. And that's because we don't have a commercial composting facility in Oregon that can actually compost those plastics. And the last statistic I heard, which Anna probably has more up-to-date information than I do, but there are only 7 facilities in the US that are capable of actually breaking down those compostable plastics, like compostable plastic utensils in the entire country, 7. So that's why, again, definitions are really important, because otherwise it really is just greenwashing, and those compostable utensils act like traditional plastic, especially in the marine environment. They require very, very specific conditions to actually break down. And so the people writing the laws need to know all of this and work with the attorneys that know the legalese to put it in for the bill. So that's why it's all complicated and is really difficult to read, essentially. But this is like the most simple definition I've seen. And when we start thinking about implementation, it can get a little complicated, because how do you know if something is compostable in your home bin? So then we start getting into like truth in labeling. Like, is this thing actually compostable? And that's like a whole complex system. And there was actually a bill proposed that's no longer moving forward in this legislative session that started to address truth in labeling. Like, are things actually recyclable? Like, if you look at the recyclable definition in this bill, it's material that can be collected by curbside recycling service providers, which is different depending on who your hauler is. So something that is recyclable in Portland might not be recyclable in Newport. So it kind of puts the onus a little bit on the restaurants in this case to know what's recyclable. And then of course the people doing the enforcement need to know that as well. But this gets really explicit in it must be recyclable locally. And so we've been able to kind of narrow in those definitions. And then when you look at like this, reusable food service ware means food service ware designed and manufactured to be materially durable and maintain its shape and structure for a cycle of at least 1,000 uses that includes washing and sanitizing by immersion for at least 30 seconds in water at no less than 171 degrees Fahrenheit. Pretty explicit. That's definitely an example of trying to close the loopholes. Also requires knowing what it takes to sanitize something. But that's, again, kind of learning when people go for those loopholes, how we close them. And then this bill, I was just going to note, does not include preemption in it. So if a local municipality were to pass a comprehensive foodware ordinance, and then the state passed this bill, their ordinance with that current language would be able to remain in effect. Okay, questions about bills, because next we're going to take a look at an ordinance. And I know this is all, we can't 100% fully understand the legalese, but usually there's some sort of, oftentimes there's an organization working on these issues, and they probably have a one-pager about the bill if they're working on it, and that'll be in easier to understand language. Or you can utilize earlier sessions and reach out to your representative or senator and ask them questions about the bill as well.
Quick anecdote, it's important to think about who the bill, who wrote the bill, because that might give you a tip on what to look for. And this was kind of like a obvious example, but I'll never forget, in around 2008, there was a bill being proposed in California, and I was living there then, that was supporting, it was anti-gay marriage, but the title of the bill was yes on something. So it made people think, oh, yes to gay marriage, and you had to just read a little bit more to realize that voting yes actually meant no. So just knowing like who's putting forth a bill, and simple tricks of language. I mean, I made tons of phone calls just to make sure that people understood what the bill even was, because just confusing yes and no can confuse lots of people who don't have the time to sit down and really think about it or read about it. So
yeah, that's a really important note, because just like we as Surfrider are advocating for these bills that regulate plastic pollution, you have opposition fighting against them and proposing their own bills, like the straw bill. So it can get tricky, which is why in some ways it's really important to actually look at the bill language, because the bill language is what the elected officials are making their decision on. They're not making their decision on like how Surfrider is selling it, or how the language we're using, or the language that Coca-Cola is using for a bill. They're looking at this bill language. That's what is going to ultimately become law. And so that's why it can be really important to actually look at the bill language and not just read what other people are saying about it.
I think, yeah, with like the plastics industry, they might be using more language about what the consumer should be doing and kind of putting the burden on the consumer, whereas really we should be looking upstream at the materials that are being produced and the corporations producing them and putting the laws more there. So something to keep in mind too.
All right, so taking a look at an ordinance, and I just picked one that I worked on, so I'm familiar with. Ordinances definitely look different, and they usually start with all of these whereas statements. And essentially the whereas statements are like the reasoning behind why the city was pursuing this bill. So you can see in here reference to another community plan, the 2040 vision plan, which has information about how the city wants to preserve and enjoy the environment, costs associated with recycling, just kind of all of the reasons why they're pursuing this ordinance. And then you get down after the whereas into section 1, all of those sections, similar to what was in a bill, although I find ordinances a little easier to read, and they have this nice sort of table of contents at the beginning that you can see. So there's more like purpose statement, and then we get into the definitions, which we've already gone through the definitions. And this one, this ordinance is fairly similar to the definitions that were used in the statewide bill. Something I like to see in bills, this is just the definition, but later, like city-sponsored events, and making sure that it's applicable to those city-sponsored events. So we're still in the definitions of this ordinance. You can see tons and tons of definitions. It needs to be defined in the law, so that way it's abundantly clear what types of businesses, what types of materials, what types of bags, all of that. And you'll see undue hardship is also defined, and we'll get to that section and we can talk about that a little bit. So then you get into your regulations. So no retail establishment shall provide or make available to a customer a single-use plastic bag. No person shall distribute them. So like no one can distribute them at a city facility or a city sponsored event. And paper bags must be recyclable as defined. And then this one has a separate section for the cost of a paper bag. So this is charging 5 cents per recyclable paper bag that is provided. And they have to put on the receipt that the customer is being charged that 5-cent fee. And then there are some exemptions that the city of Newport had in theirs. And so this is the retail establishment, so smaller retail establishments. Something that I find really interesting about this is oftentimes what I found is that managers don't know how big their store is. I have no clue. If you ask me, like, is Fred Meyer 5,000 square feet? I have no clue. And many times the managers don't know either. So it can be difficult for the businesses and then also for the consumers to know whenever there's something defining, like using square feet to define the size of a business. But the city, I believe, knows that information. They're able to communicate that information. I just found it interesting when I was talking to a couple managers that they didn't actually know. So this one is saying that just smaller businesses, because we try to work around business hardships, and there are some smaller businesses that aren't using like a computerized system for their receipts. Some might be using like an old school cash register. And so it's saying smaller businesses can be exempt from actually printing that 5-cent fee on the receipt if it's a burden for them to do so. There's also in here an exemption. So again, thinking about like justice, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and also hardships that can be created by laws. Right here, you see that anyone who has a women, infants, and children program voucher or an electronics benefit transfer or other food assistance cards are exempt from paying the 5-cent fee for paper bags. And then there's also the hardship for implementation. So when this bill took effect, businesses could write to the city manager and ask for a 6-month extension if there's going to be some sort of hardship implementing this law. And then of course, there's the violation and penalty information and the effective date. And so sometimes the effective date is very soon after an ordinance is signed. Sometimes the effective date is longer. So the comprehensive foodware ban, that was the state bill that was proposed, for example, because there's been a lot of restaurant hardship due to the pandemic. That one, even though it was in the 2020 session, wouldn't have taken effect until 2023 to give businesses adequate time to get ready to be able to comply with that law. And so that's something that elected bodies do have control over, is that effective date. Typically, it's like what we see is it's starting like the first of the following year for bills, but for ordinances, it's really whatever the city wants to do. And then of course they'll have public comment during the hearings and might choose to change that. But this one was passed, so you can see this is the final version of the ordinance that actually has all of the signatures, has the mayor's signature, and shows that it passed by a vote of 5-2 and when it was actually signed. Questions about ordinances? Is there any like a bill or an ordinance that you're curious about that we can take a look at and try to, if anyone has anything, we can pull something up and try to work through it together? All right, that is what I had for you.
Hopefully that makes things less confusing, not more confusing. Um, but just
Take it
know
in like just digestible chunks.
exactly. Exactly. Yeah, Jean?
So I think that that it would be a good exercise for when people are going to be doing this to find a partner or partners and sit down and do it together.
Yeah.
And very helpful structure. Thank both of you, Anna and Bree, for walking us through those. That helps a lot.
Thank you.
Yeah, this definitely made it less scary. um, one thing I would like to add, I just use this in everyday life, is control find on my computer or command find on Macs. If you're just looking for like a specific word, can be super helpful too.
Yeah.
I'm also curious if anyone knows the average cost of a paper bag.
Oh man, I'm digging deep, but it depends on a lot of different factors, like if it has handles or not, and what kind of handles, and it depends on the quantity of bags that are being ordered. So the range that I've been told is anywhere from 2.5 cents to 7.5 cents.
Hmm.
I'm gonna look to Anna if you know from your research. I know you're focused on plastic, but
No, I don't know about paper. Didn't get into paper.
yeah, so it really depends, like especially what we were hearing from some small businesses like boutiques or things like that that have like a nice quality paper bag with the like, you know, the more of the like twisted paper handle. So it's like the nicer the bag, and then they have the reinforcements, the handles don't fall off. Like those bags are more expensive. But I think typically it's cheaper for the bigger retailers because they're ordering much larger quantities versus those like nicer paper bags that are fancier.
Mhm.
But a business could just choose to charge for paper bags. That's something that they can do as a business. So even if the law says 5 cents, but they're using a super fancy paper bag, they could charge 10 cents if they wanted.
Interesting. Just a random thought I had while we were talking about bags.
Yeah. Yeah, it's just like, I mean, there are businesses, there are restaurants that charge like a 50-cent takeout fee because you are using more materials from them. And they just are choosing to do that as part of their business model to recover costs. But yeah, the control find, one thing I will note is that for ordinances, that often doesn't work because you might not have been able to tell, but on that Newport City ordinance, it's the system they use to digitize documents. It's a scan and not a readable PDF, which is like, I'm not going to go off on a tangent, but I will just mention that that's not an accessible document according to the American Disabilities Act. So someone who is seeing impaired wouldn't be able to use their software to read that ordinance because it's scanned, and so it's not readable by software. And you can't use the find function either on it. And I've asked city and county governments about it, and it's like the software that almost all of them use for all their public records, the problem is with them. And I think there have been requests to deal with it, and you know, some municipalities are working on it more than others. But just an interesting tidbit that if you can't use your find function, then software also can't read that, and it's not accessible.
Very interesting. Jean, I love your idea of reading with a friend. It's almost like a book club, you know, you can the having two sets of eyes. It's like you can bounce ideas off each other. Does this language mean what I think it means? And picking up what the other person might miss. So I think that's a great idea.
And we also were looking at the tracking, when we were looking at tracking bills and ordinances. I mentioned reading the city manager's report for at the ordinance level, and that usually provides like more plain language, but what the actual ordinance is about. So those like any city staff reports are really good resource to look at when you're researching an ordinance or any decision where there's like legalese in it. Usually the staff report is easier to understand. Jean.
Yeah, I was just going to throw into Anna, and it's more fun if you do it with other people. And we might as well make it fun if we're doing this, right?
Yeah, if you're just sitting in a dark corner reading this terrible legal language, it doesn't sound very fun, but make it fun. Yeah. Great. All right. Well, thank you all so much for joining. Your homework is just to, research some laws and look at one, especially one that's maybe been confusing or intimidating in some way, and just kind of go through those definitions and kind of understand what the italics mean versus the strike throughs versus the bold, and just see if you can get through a law and feel like, okay, I know what this all means.
And if you have questions, you can send them to us and we can help work through. Jean.
So I do have a question, so if I'm reading, let's say I live in Coos Bay. So if I'm reading a proposed local ordinance and I'm having difficulty understanding, and let's say I talk with my partner, and if he's not able to help me understand it, and let's just suppose it's not a Surfrider thing, so it might not be something I wanted to bring to Surfrider, where would I go to
Carmen
get
Matthews.
clarification?
I would, in this case, since you know a city councilor, that's the first place I would go, is the city councilor, if it's a city ordinance, because they should know the law, the proposed ordinance well enough to be able to answer your questions. City staff also are really great resources. So whether it's your city manager or city recorder, they can be, they're very, very busy people. And actually, when I've emailed with the city manager in Coos Bay, I've gotten a pretty quick response. But if there's something happening, then sometimes they're really busy. But city staff or city councilors, sometimes it's really interesting just to ask the city councilors about their understanding and kind of test them and see if they understand it, because they're going to be making a decision on it. So that can also be really interesting. There's a city attorney. I don't usually go like straight to them to ask questions, but the city attorney is reviewing all of these before they're approved, and the city attorney is at the council meetings as well. And the council will sometimes defer to them and ask them questions when they're considering ordinances. So there is the legal eye that's on that as well. So kind of depends on your situation, but if you know a city councilor and you're like friends with them, I would just go there first. They can defer you to city staff and say, oh, I think, the staff have been researching this, and they can answer your specific question better. So it kind of depends on like who's more responsive, and we'll get back to you. And that's going to be different for each city.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay. Great. Well, thank you all for joining today. Hopefully that was helpful and you have some more resources at your fingertips.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Have a good day, and hopefully we'll see you next week.
Yeah.
All right. Cool.
Right.
Thank
Have
you.
a great weekend.
And thanks. Great question. Oh, Jessica took off.
Oh.
Just gonna thank her. That was really good. Just saying about find. So
Yeah.
Mhm.
It's a powerful tool.
Yes.
all right. So
Great.
go.
Good to see you. Bye.
Bye bye.
Mhm.